Greetings and welcome to In Depth. I'm Dike Rostant. The rainy season started a bit earlier than the 1st of June this year, and that may make this conversation on disaster preparedness for 2022 even more topical. We are joined by training and education specialist Franchesca, as well as planning and development officer Anwar Baksh, both of the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Management. Welcome, Ms. Peters. Welcome, Mr. Baksh. And we're very grateful you're able to make the time. Now, Ms. Peters, while many people, I guess, would have a basic understanding of the ODPM's role, can you expand on that mandate for us? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much for inviting us on your program. So the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Management is a common name, ODPM, ODPM, ODPM. But what exactly is our responsibility? So we are the National Disaster Coordinating Agency for Trinidad and Tobago. So we are the coordinating agency for disaster management in Trinidad and Tobago. We're quite a small organization. We rely on all of the government ministries and agencies to effectively manage or to implement comprehensive disaster management in Trinidad and Tobago. We don't do it alone. So we are responsible for the implementation of comprehensive disaster management. It's not just about response. When something happens, responding and jumping out in the field. It starts long before that. So when we speak about comprehensive disaster management, we are speaking about mitigation, reducing your risk. So do you, for example, if you live in a flood-prone area, what mitigation methods can you take? Sandbagging, making sure you have flood barrier walls, making sure that as a company you trim the trees that are on your property. So there are things that you can do beforehand that can reduce your risk. Preparedness activities. We make sure that the schools are prepared or young population understand how to respond if a disaster occurs. Then there's response, coordinating the various agencies when something actually happens. And then recovery. Persons may be impacted from time to time and ensuring that they receive the necessary relief through the various agencies responsible for that mandate, but then also ensuring that they are able to build back better. And therefore, if it occurs again, hopefully they can be less impacted. So we as an agency, we are responsible for spearheading comprehensive disaster management and moving away from that response-centric approach. But we are also responsible for the implementation of climate change adaptation programs. So we support that. So there are many ministries and agencies that also work with us in terms of climate change adaptation because they work hand in hand when we're speaking about disasters. So we have to preserve our environment, and earth conservation is critical to what we do so that we can experience less severe disasters. So in reality, as a coordinating agency, we work with various agencies for the implementation of comprehensive disaster management across Trinidad and Tobago.
Ms. Peters, I see your hair is jet black, so I'm not going to ask you what it is like to actually coordinate between some of these agencies that you need to. But let me ask you, though, to lay out for us in terms of like who are some of those stakeholders, because the other day I would have seen the ODPM sharing the agrometeorological forecast. Then there was also some work that was being done by the Ministry of Local Government. So who are some of those specific agencies or stakeholders that you would say, okay, well, these are some of the people that we are coordinating within?
Okay, sure. So you have alerting agencies such as the Trinidad and Tobago Meteorological Service. That's an alerting agency. So they are monitoring the weather and they will tell us, okay, there's a possibility of a tropical disturbance. We have to know to prepare for adverse weather. So they are an alerting agency. Then we would also have those first responders. So you have the Ministry of Rural Development and Local Government, and most persons will know their disaster management unit, DMUs. We have TEMA, the Tobago Emergency Management Agency. You have the Trinidad and Tobago Fire Service, the Police Service. We work with the Ministry of Works and Transport, which would be like a secondary responder. So we work with the Trinidad and Tobago Defense Force, so many agencies, and it all depends on the incident. So for example, power outage, you're working with TNTech. If there's a water issue, you're working with WASA. You may be even working with the water resource agency so that you can monitor the river levels. So we work with all of the different agencies across Trinidad and Tobago in order to coordinate disaster management.
And thank you so much for that. Mr. Baksh, let me bring you into the conversation. Thank you, and thank you for your patience. Now, the way that Ms. Peters would have just spoken and locked in on that word coordinating and the role of ODPM, I know that you're very specific with language and narrative. So in terms of making the distinction between a risk versus a hazard versus a disaster, what are some of those types of disasters that we can potentially face in Trinidad and Tobago?
Thanks, Dike, for that very interesting question. You know, Trinidad and Tobago operates in a multi-hazard perspective, and we must understand that Trinidad as an island compared to Tobago has two totally different risk profiles. So while we are both exposed and poses the risk or susceptible to impacts of hydrometeorological events, for Trinidad, we may see that flooding is a major risk, while for Tobago, landslides may be one of the major risks for their islands. So hydromet events in terms of tropical storms, tropical cyclones, and then there are the secondary hazards because of this: flooding, landslide, blown roofs, fallen trees. But then again, while those are hydromet events which we are accustomed to, there are the unprecedented ones, the ones that we cannot predict, the unpredictable ones, earthquake. We cannot predict an earthquake. So, and that is the biggest risk to Trinidad and Tobago at this point in time, earthquakes. Hope that answers your question.
And thank you much, but let me just follow to dive down a little more in terms of making those distinctions a little more apparent between when do we use the word risk, when do we use the word hazard, when do we use the word disaster?
Well, a disaster really happens when your capacity is overwhelmed, when your capabilities to respond to respond to the impacts of a hazard is overwhelmed. You know, when there is death, when there's destruction, that's when a disaster happens. A hazard really is a rainfall event, an earthquake, a hurricane. Our risk really means that the level at which we are exposed, the level of which we are able to respond to disaster, etc. So if our capacities are not strong enough, then our risks are higher.
All right, and we want to thank you so much for that. And Ms. Peters, we know that May was declared National Disaster Prevention and Preparedness Month, and I think this was in 2020, but we're at the tail end of June now. What are some of those activities that would have happened in May this year with regard to the ODPM building awareness? And what are some of those things that are next on the horizon? We have a minute and a half, and most likely we need to continue your answer on the other side of the conversation.
Okay, no problem. So National Disaster Prevention and Preparedness Month 2022 was a success. Since it was declared in 2020, most of it because of COVID-19 would have been done virtually. And this was the first time that we would have been able to come out, and we did in full force. Through the multi-sectoral committee, we were able to execute 3 major public education caravans. We did one in North and Brian Lara Promenade, South on Harris Promenade, and we did one in Tobago in the Port Mall. Those were the major public education caravans, but we still went into the communities. We did 4 community outreaches as well. We executed evacuation drills within the various primary schools. And we also would have implemented a media campaign with your very own Ayinka Will. And persons may have seen that Know Your Risk video, which is the start of the campaign. And we would have aired it across the whole month, and it will continue as we go along. And the reality of it is that's just the start. Disaster preparedness is a year-round activity. So while we would have had a successful month of May, persons can look forward to a media campaign continuing as we go along.
And in terms of that media campaign continuing, the conversation continues. We do this with Anwar Baksh and Franchesca. Peters, stay with us. We return with more. Welcome back. We are discussing the work of the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Management. We're doing so with Franchesca Peters, Training and Education Specialist, as well as Planning and Development Officer Anwar Baksh. And just before we took the break, Ms. Peters, you spoke about the fact that this building awareness, building resilience, building capacity, it is something that is year-round as opposed to, hey, it's around hurricane season, time to make sure we have this or time to make sure we have that. But sometimes it can feel as though we know what we're supposed to know, but we don't necessarily do what we're supposed to do. And with that, I ask you, Mr. Baksh, how is the ODPM working to ensure that we can be more alert, we can be readier as it relates to hazards and the potential impacts?
I'm so glad that you said that we know what we are supposed to do, but we don't do it. And that is one of the biggest risks to Trinidad and Tobago, in that we tend to operate that God is a Trinian. And that is something that I always like to change. God is not a Trini. But in terms of knowing our risk or knowing what to do in the event of a potential impact, ODPM is seeking to advance a project called the Community Flood Early Warning System project. And this project is, as it says, Community Flood Early Warning System. We are working with agencies like the Ministry of Rural Development and Local Government, as well as the Water Resource Agency, to introduce within 7 pilot communities at this point in time. I won't call the names yet. Rain river gauges that allows us to have an idea of when there is a potential overspill of a river. With this, it allows a system to be developed for an alert to be sent out to community members that this river will overflow in a particular amount of time, and then you should evacuate, or you should get to higher grounds, or you should introduce sandbags to prevent water from coming into your home. And that is just one method of doing alerting and enabling persons to become aware of what are their potential risks of flood. Over to you.
I love the fact that you talk about one enabling, two, even though you cut the wind out of my sails, because I was going to ask, so which places, Mr. Baksh, which communities? But do you think that this will have people a little more committed and wedded to their own safety? Because I can see, okay, well, someone is checking that gauge if it's something that needs to be done manually. And even though they're looking at the level, they're also saying, okay, well, there are these things that are in the river that are not supposed to be. So they also keep an eye out for brothers and sisters who are throwing things into the rivers that they're not supposed to, which is one of the things that leads to the problems that we have in the first place.
Yeah. Certainly. So tacit knowledge is that $1 investment into an early warning system can save you $4 US of response and recovery. And that has been a line that has been going through the disaster management landscape. And therefore, by us investing into this system for early warnings within communities, for floods in this case, it really helps persons to become more aware. They feel a little more comfortable that they will be alerted. And it's not just a system that we are intending to leave alone within these 7 communities. It's a system that we are hoping to expand throughout Trinidad and Tobago, as well as add other hazards to it throughout our alerting system.
But I'll add something there, because while we are looking at the river gauges in 7 communities, I want to also add that it exists in other communities as well. So it's an expansion. And we are also working on a mass notification system for Trinidad and Tobago. We are actually at the final stages of it and doing the internal training to ensure that the system is sustainable, so that persons can get alerts via emails, your phone. You can actually get a phone call if something is happening in the country. So while, yes, we would also have the river gauges and so forth, we are looking at it comprehensively. So we also have a mass notification system that's actually in the final stages and will be launched soon. And that is using the Everbridge system, which is used internationally, one of the best systems there is in the world. So we really, really know that we're working on it overall. So even though it's within 7 communities, it's an expansion of projects. And we're also working on a mass notification system so that persons can get alerts faster and to know what is happening in the country.
And I'm really glad you speak about the mass notification system, Ms. Peters, because I think there have been 2 times that I have gotten, I think it was text messages to my phone from ODPM, I think, asking, okay, did you get this message? Please respond if you did.
Right.
So it seems as though this is something that has been rolling out in incremental steps, which is sometimes better than just say, okay, well, you hurry, more haste, less speed. So are there any other things that you want to tell us that you're working on, not necessarily for timelines, but at the same time, okay, well, these are things that we're working on?
Yes, but I want to thank those persons who would have responded to our SMS, because we got at least 3,000 persons signing up to say, here what, we are interested in testing this platform with you. And that's where we are starting. So right now we're working on internal tests and working with our stakeholders. Then we will be moving forward to those persons who would have responded to the SMS and stated that I am interested in getting alerts from ODPM. And I want to thank those persons who would have responded to our wet season and dry season SMS alerts. Because don't think that we have forgotten you. We will be coming to you soon and testing that system before we do a national rollout. Because at the end of the day, we want to build a sustainable system. We want to ensure that it works effectively. So we are going to test with those 3,000 persons who prompted into the system first, and then we will be doing a national rollout of a mass notification system.
And with that in mind, though, are there any tips on how persons can be better prepared? Because yes, we had the conversation that yes, we basically have a general idea and knowledge, but sometimes it's action as opposed to you know better, do better. But what are some of those things, Ms. Peters, that we can say, okay, well, these are ways, because I think it bears telling again, so you can't say we didn't say. So what are those things that you'd want to tell individuals or groupings to help them better prepare themselves for the wet and hurricane season?
I want to start by saying you must be prepared at all times. I know we have a typical way in Trinidad and Tobago that we will prepare when something happens. A tropical storm watch is issued, a hurricane watch is issued. We run to the grocery now. We now hearing everybody ponging the roof. We now know that we need to get ready. And really and truly, we want to stop doing that. At the end of the day, we need to be prepared at all times. That's one thing the pandemic should have taught us, because we could be dealing with the pandemic, and then we could happen to have an earthquake, as Anwar would have mentioned earlier. We could have an earthquake, then possibly a tsunami watch or actual tsunami. And that could happen in wet or dry season. It's not limited to any season. So persons need to be prepared year round. And that's important because persons often think that they will come to me, I'll get the water, I'll get the food. But the reality of it is, if there's massive disruption, think of an earthquake. Look online, we have our phones, we have access to technology. Look at the after effect when something major happens. If you look at when a major earthquake happens, your environment does not look the same. Your community that you're familiar with, the road network that you're familiar with, will not look the same to you. And therefore, you have to be prepared ahead of time, because if we have over 100,000 persons affected, you are your first responder first. You are responsible for your family. You within your community, you are your first responder until help arrives. We will not be able to get to everyone immediately. So by you being prepared ahead of time, that will bring comfort to you and your family, and it can also save your life.
Because thank you so much, and I want to give the last minute to Mr. Baksh, please, in terms of closing comments.
Sure.
Certainly, when last did you walk around your house and see if your roof needs to fix, if there's a clogged drain, if there's a tree that poses a risk to your roof? And these are things that need people to know your risk at your individual level and prepare your homes so that in the event of a hazard impact, your disaster impacts will be very low. Over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Anwar Baksh and Franchesca Peters, working out of the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Management. And on behalf of the entire TTT News team, this has been In Depth with me, Dike Rostant. Thank you so much for joining us.